Mothman enjoys the occasional espresso. From Jersey Lore. I've always been a night owl, which is why working at a coffee shop that stayed open until midnight seemed perfect for me. It was a Saturday evening during that transitional period between summer and fall, when the air begins to carry a peculiar chill that settles deep in your bones. The sky had darkened prematurely that night. Rain pounded against our windows. One of those erratic autumn storms where the downpour intensifies without warning, subsides momentarily, then returns with a vengeance that makes you question whether nature itself is angry. The forecast had predicted thunderstorms, which always made me uneasy, but I wasn't about to let it ruin my shift. I was working behind the counter, chatting with Jeannie, who was finishing up her shift, wiping down tables and preparing to head home. She joked that with the oppressive darkness and the thunder's continuous rumble, it felt like we were trapped in a low-budget horror film. I laughed nervously at that. I only mention it now because of how unnervingly prescient her comment would prove to be. Around 9 p.m. she clocked out, leaving me alone with Jacob, the manager who mostly sequestered himself in the back office doing inventory. We had only a handful of customers scattered throughout the cafe. 2 college students hunched over textbooks, a middle-aged man absorbed in his newspaper, and a young woman mindlessly scrolling through her phone. The storm intensified about an hour later. Lightning sliced through the darkness, illuminating our cafe through the expansive picture windows that faced the street. Our shop occupied a corner with floor-to-ceiling windows, so each lightning strike transformed the entire space into a disorienting strobe-lit scene. Initially it was captivating, nature's own light show performing just for us. But the thunder that pursued each flash was deafening, violently rattling the windows until I began to fear they might shatter. After one particularly blinding flash, I noticed movement across the street. There was a small office building with a flat rooftop. In that fractional moment of illumination, I glimpsed something perched on the edge. Something that resembled an animal but was disturbingly larger than any bird you'd expect to find in an urban setting. I instinctively pressed my palm against the window, straining to see through the torrential rain. But the darkness had reclaimed everything. Another lightning strike cut through the sky, and the shape had vanished. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of light, or perhaps an unusually large crow. But a profound sense of wrongness had settled in the pit of my stomach. I forced myself back to work, steaming milk for a customer's latte, and directing my thoughts toward mundane tasks. I focused on creating intricate latte art, something I normally enjoyed. I reminded myself that we'd likely have few customers for the remainder of the night, making my job relatively straightforward. But the image of that thing remained burned into my consciousness, refusing to dissolve. Just before 10:30, the cafe emptied except for one final patron, Will, one of our regulars. He was a physics graduate student at the local university, who often utilized our late hours for studying. That evening, he had been absorbed in his laptop screen, occasionally lifting his gaze to observe the tempest outside. I was wiping down the counter near the pastry display, when he suddenly called out, "Hey, did you see that?" My body went rigid. See what? There was something out there, he said, pointing toward the window. Looked like some kind of unusual bird or something. When he said those words, a wave of vertigo nearly overcame me. Yeah, actually I thought I saw something earlier too. On the roof across the street. Will stood and approached the window. No, just now. It looked like it was on the street lamp. I only glimpsed it for a split second when the lightning flashed, and then it was gone. I joined him at the window, both of us peering into the downpour. The sidewalk appeared deserted, save for the occasional passing car. There was no evidence of anything unusual, yet Will's complexion had turned ashen. I could tell this was no joke. Probably just a large hawk, or an owl, I suggested, attempting to sound convincing. But my voice betrayed me, with a slight tremor. He hastily packed up his laptop, mumbled a quick good night, and departed. The moment he stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him from a powerful gust of wind, accompanied by a thunderous boom. I watched him hurry away, hunched under his jacket. Now I was completely alone in the front of the shop. Jacob remained in the office, and suddenly, the cafe felt unnaturally silent. I turned on some background music, something soft and soothing to calm my nerves. I tried to keep myself occupied. We were running low on cups and lids, so I restocked those. Yet I couldn't stop myself from periodically glancing out the window, just to check. The storm had intensified to the point where rain was falling horizontally. The lightning strikes had become less frequent, but when they occurred, they illuminated the entire block with an eerie, blue-white glow. Around 11 p.m., Jacob emerged to help with final tasks. I asked if he would remain up front with me, confessing that the storm had me feeling on edge. I mentioned the strange shape I'd seen through the window earlier. He chuckled, muttering something about how storms can play tricks on the mind. Nevertheless, he agreed to stay with me until closing so we could leave together. I felt relief wash over me, though I wanted to protest that I wasn't being childish. I kept that thought to myself. Time crawled by. Eventually, the thunder receded to a distant rumble. The lightning moved farther away. By 11:30 p.m., we were certain no more customers would arrive, so we began our closing procedures, cleaning the espresso machine, counting the register, and storing away pastries. We switched off the neon open sign, leaving only the subdued overhead lights that cast long shadows across the floor. That's when the power began to flicker. The lights dimmed, returned, then extinguished completely for several terrifying seconds. My heart seemed to lodge itself in my throat each time darkness descended. Then with an ominous hum, the electricity stabilized. Jacob went to check the circuit breaker, leaving me alone at the front counter again, facing those vast windows. Despite the overhead lights, the street outside remained an impenetrable void of rain and darkness. I found myself staring at the building across the street, with its low rooftop. The only illumination there came from a nearby street lamp, but it barely penetrated the gloom. I almost missed it, until lightning flashed again, so brilliant it might have struck directly overhead. That's when I saw it, a massive silhouette, perched on the ledge. This time, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but with enormous folded wings, arching behind it. The flash lasted perhaps a second, but time seemed to dilate, allowing me to discern two faint luminous points, where eyes should be. When the lightning faded, plunging everything back into darkness, I stumbled backward, my heart hammering so violently, I could feel it in my throat. Jacob must have heard my involuntary gasp, because he rushed into the front. "What happened?" he demanded. I pointed at the window, my finger trembling. "There's something on the roof over there. Jacob, I swear I saw something. Something unnatural." He frowned, but cautiously approached the window. "I don't see anything. It's too dark." "Are you sure you didn't mistake a statue or perhaps some maintenance equipment?" "I know what I saw," I insisted. "The thing had wings like an enormous bat." The words sounded deranged, coming from my mouth, but I was absolutely certain. Goosebumps covered my arms. Jacob grabbed his phone and activated the flashlight, shining it through the window. Of course, all we could see was our own reflection against the glass. The wind continued to assault the door, making it rattle ominously. For a moment we both stood frozen, uncertain what to do next. Thunder crashed again, closer now, as if the storm were circling back toward us. "I need to lock up," I told Jacob. "We should leave immediately." He nodded. We hastily completed shutdown procedures, turned off the lights, and secured everything. I grabbed my coat, mentally preparing to make a desperate sprint to my car. As we stepped outside, the rain struck us with painful force, and the wind rendered my umbrella useless within seconds. I abandoned it, allowing the gust to invert it completely. Jacob apparently had the same idea, because he was already halfway to his vehicle. shouting something that was swallowed by the storm's fury. Suddenly, a jagged fork of lightning split the sky above us. For an instant, it illuminated not just the street, but the rooftop and the churning clouds. I looked up and saw that same creature rising from the building, unfurling enormous bat-like wings and launching into the night. Its eyes reflected the lightning in a way that made them appear to glow crimson. I froze, like prey paralyzed before a predator. My mouth fell open as I watched it ascend, silently praying it wouldn't descend upon me. The entire sighting lasted less than a second, but an image like that becomes permanently etched into your consciousness. I released a strangled cry, fumbling to unlock my car door. My hands were so slick with rain that the task seemed impossible, but eventually, I managed to get inside, slamming the door and engaging the locks. Jacob had already started his engine. I saw his headlights cut through the darkness, and I peeled out of my parking space behind him, heedless of puddles or potholes. The following morning I called Jeannie, asking if she had noticed anything unusual that night, but she'd left too early. She listened to my rambling account, half skeptical and half concerned. She suggested that perhaps it was some large bird caught in the storm. I desperately wished she was right, but that was no bird. Birds don't have humanoid forms with massive bat wings, and I don't believe a bird would trigger that primal sense of terror, that instinctive knowledge that you're in the presence of something profoundly wrong and potentially malevolent. Will, the graduate student regular, returned a few days later, clearly wanting to discuss the strange occurrence. When I admitted I'd seen it too, he asked if I was absolutely certain about what I'd witnessed. I confessed that I was. I still work at that cafe, though I've arranged my schedule to ensure my shifts end well before darkness falls. There haven't been any additional sightings, at least none that I'm aware of. But I do find myself compulsively checking that rooftop whenever I glance through the window, dreading what I might see. And when rain begins to fall during my shift, I experience what must be a form of post-traumatic stress. My stomach clenches painfully, and anxiety overtakes me. Whether it was Mothman or some other entity, I can only hope our paths never cross again.
Starbucks near the Overpass from Taunted_2. I manage a certain Starbucks off the interstate in Massachusetts. I won't specify exactly where, but people often joke that it's in the middle of nowhere, because aside from our small cluster of shops and gas stations, the surrounding area is largely deserted. Nevertheless, we maintain steady business thanks to travelers, truck drivers, and locals commuting to and from work. The location itself isn't particularly distinctive. Standard green awnings, drive-through window, bright interior with tables where college students spread out their laptops. Virtually identical to any other Starbucks franchise. But there is one unusual feature: we're situated adjacent to a crumbling old overpass that once formed part of a rail line decades ago. Today it's merely a decrepit bridge spanning a dried-up creek bed and an abandoned side road. Local lore claims it's haunted. There's a persistent story about a young woman who vanished near that location in the 1960s. Ever since, people report glimpsing a figure beneath that bridge late at night, sometimes wearing a white dress, sometimes holding a lantern. It sounds like a typical ghost story, right? I used to roll my eyes whenever customers mentioned it. I don't roll my eyes anymore. Everything changed a few months ago. I typically work early shifts, arriving at 4:30 a.m. to prepare for opening. I prefer mornings, but as manager, I occasionally need to cover other time slots when necessary. One night I was assigned to close when our regular closer called in sick at the last minute. This meant I'd be at the shop until approximately 11 p.m., completing the final count and securing the premises. It wasn't my preferred schedule, but it was my responsibility. Around 9 p.m., we dimmed the dining room lights, leaving just enough illumination for cleaning. Only the drive-thru remained operational for another hour. It was a quiet night with minimal traffic through the drive-thru during that final stretch. My shift supervisor, Kendra, was reorganizing inventory in the back. I was out front wiping counters and verifying stock levels. As I passed the windows facing the overpass, something caught my attention. The streetlight near the bridge provided minimal illumination at best, and with trees casting shadows, visibility was severely limited. Yet for a fleeting moment, I detected someone walking beneath the bridge. Initially, I assumed it might be a homeless individual seeking shelter from the cold. We occasionally encounter transients in the area, though usually closer to the highway on ramps. I didn't give it much thought at first. I finished cleaning and went to dispose of the garbage. Our dumpster is located around the side of the building, offering a partial view of the overpass. By then it was nearly 10 p.m. The air felt damp and heavy, and the night was unnaturally silent, except for the distant hum of vehicles on the interstate. As I closed the dumpster lid, I heard a sound resembling shuffling or scraping metal. I turned toward the overpass. Though I couldn't discern anyone, I experienced an acute sensation of being observed, that prickling feeling that begins at the nape of your neck and spreads across your scalp. I hurried back inside, securing the side door behind me. Kendra noticed my discomfort and asked if everything was all right. I brushed it off, merely stating, "I thought I heard something strange near the bridge." We both laughed it away, discussing how customers frequently claimed to have seen the overpass ghost. We exchanged stories patrons had shared, how a woman in a white dress supposedly stands by the concrete pillars, or how some nights you can see her lantern swinging beneath the bridge. We joked that perhaps we might gain an additional customer if the ghost developed a craving for a latte. We completed closing procedures and parted ways around 10:45 p.m. Kendra got into her car and drove off. I remained behind briefly to handle the day's deposit. Around 11 p.m., I stepped out to head to my own vehicle. That's when I noticed a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our parking lot lights. The silhouette was tall and hunched forward slightly, as if attempting to remain inconspicuous. I hesitated. "Hello?" I called out, more to reassure myself than anything else. The figure shifted a step closer into the faint light, revealing a stooped man in tattered clothing with what appeared to be a dirty hood pulled over his head. I relaxed marginally. It wasn't a ghost, just a disheveled transient, but something about him sent chills through me. Perhaps it was the unnatural stillness of his posture, or the hollow quality of his stare. "Do you need assistance?" I asked, striving to sound courteous and composed. He offered no response. He didn't move. I felt increasingly uneasy. Normally I would offer water or directions to someone in need, but his silence was deeply unsettling. I decided to proceed to my car, which was unfortunately parked closer to him than I would have preferred. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the pavement. As I reached my door, I glanced back, and the man had vanished completely. There was nowhere obvious he could have concealed himself, unless he had darted behind the building with remarkable speed. In that moment, I recalled the stories of the haunted overpass, the missing girl, all the local folklore. But that was just a man, wasn't it? Even so, I felt profoundly disturbed by the encounter. I drove home trying to dismiss my unease. The following morning, I discussed the strange incident with Kendra and several other baristas. They teased me good-naturedly, but also shared their own experiences. One had discovered unusual footprints near the dumpster and heard faint moaning sounds on certain nights. Another had glimpsed someone beneath the bridge when the lights flickered, and only when they flickered. Nothing conclusive or direct, but collectively unsettling. Eventually, we referred to it as our resident ghost, though I remained uncertain whether we were dealing with a supernatural entity or simply an unusual person loitering in the area. A few weeks later, I was assigned another closing shift. This time, I vigilantly monitored the windows. Sure enough, around 9:30 p.m., I detected movement near the overpass. I lowered the music volume to listen. Through the glass, I heard a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. Was it the same individual from before? I decided to expedite closing procedures. Kendra was working again that night, so I quietly advised her to finish quickly and not linger afterward. We secured the doors and deactivated most lights. By 10:15 p.m., I ensured the drive-through window was locked, then stepped outside to verify the main entrance was secure. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps on wet pavement. I spun around, expecting to see the disheveled man. Instead, a silhouette stood near the overpass, partially obscured by the row of shrubs. The figure's posture was unnaturally rigid, arms hanging stiffly at its sides, head angled in my direction. I sensed it was staring at me, though I couldn't be certain in the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized this person was wearing something white or pale. It reflected faintly under the distant streetlight. I rushed back inside using my key and locked the door. My heart threatened to explode from my chest. Kendra asked what was wrong, and I simply said, "There's someone under the bridge. They're just standing there." She approached the window, but by then the figure had disappeared without a trace. We decided to conclude our shift immediately, regardless of whether we had completed all closing tasks. We both hurried to our vehicles and drove away. Later, we informed the rest of the staff. Some insisted it was merely a homeless person wandering the area. Others believed I had encountered the legendary girl in white, but no one could explain the disturbing stillness of the figure, or why it vanished so abruptly. After that incident, I requested never to close alone. Even our district manager agreed to adjust the schedule, citing our history of transient activity near the property. Since then, for any shift extending past sunset, I ensure I'm not the last person to leave. The memory of that figure, whether human or something else, continues to haunt me each time I glance toward that overpass.
My stalker turned predator from Anonymous. I began working at a place called Good Vibes about 3 summers ago. It's a small cafe in a quiet Canadian region that rarely experiences significant disturbances. We're nestled between a pharmacy and a local artisan shop in a strip mall that's seen better days. The sign outside features an oversized peace symbol with whimsical lettering spelling Good Vibes, leading most people to assume we're a relaxed, friendly establishment. And truthfully, that's how we tried to operate. Customers would visit for organic tea blends, homemade pastries, and large mugs of freshly roasted coffee. We knew many of our regulars by name. My boss, Jade, embodied the heart and soul of the place. She believed in local sourcing, fair wages, and cultivating a tranquil environment. She hired me because I excelled at conversing with customers, always remembered their usual orders, and could create latte art that delighted children. Plus, having grown up in the area, I was committed to staying. While most employees came and went, I intended to remain long-term. A few months into my employment, I noticed a particular customer who stood out from the others. His name was Lawrence. He appeared to be in his early 60s with a distinctly off-kilter demeanor that caught my attention. He would hesitate at the entrance before entering, as if assessing whether it was safe to come inside. But once he made that decision, he would approach the counter directly, stare intensely at the menu board, and order black coffee, no cream, no sugar. Initially, I assumed he struggled with social anxiety. Many people with anxiety disorders find coffee shops challenging environments, so I adopted a gentle approach, offering a smile without forcing conversation, unless he initiated it. He would typically return that smile, more of an anxious twitch at the corners of his mouth than genuine warmth. He rarely engaged in extended conversation beyond commenting on the weather or asking about the coffee's origin. I later learned from Jade that he occasionally rambled about conspiracy theories or expressed paranoia about other customers watching him, though I never personally witnessed such behavior. In my interactions, he always maintained a relatively calm demeanor. Toward the end of my first year, Lawrence's behavior began to shift noticeably. He started visiting more frequently, sometimes 3 times daily. He would enter Good Vibes with nervous energy, scanning the room methodically before ordering. Then he would wait near the counter while I prepared his coffee, ignoring all vacant tables. I would ask if he wanted to sit down, but he would mutter, "No, I'm fine standing," or "I prefer to wait here." I'd hand him his coffee, and he would linger uncomfortably long,
attempting to make eye contact. It seemed as though something weighed heavily on his mind. Soon his orders transformed into inquiries about my schedule. When do you open tomorrow? What time do you usually finish work? These questions seemed innocent enough on the surface. Perhaps he was simply particular about timing. But the repetitive nature of these questions, and the intensity with which he asked them, suggested he was cataloging this information for some purpose. I mentioned this to Jade, who advised me to politely avoid sharing personal details. Still, we didn't want to treat him badly, or confront him. Lawrence had never displayed rudeness or aggression, just an unsettling intensity. Then the actual stalking commenced. I began noticing him in the parking lot, with increasing frequency, pacing near the large windows. Once, after locking the cafe at closing time, I spotted him behind the dumpster, smoking a cigarette, and staring in my direction. The following morning, I raised these concerns with Jade again. She dismissed it as mere loitering. "This area isn't particularly busy at night," she said with a shrug. "Perhaps he has nowhere else to go." But the situation escalated rapidly. One morning, I arrived exceptionally early, 6:30 a.m., to find Lawrence already waiting by the entrance. He had dark circles beneath his eyes, as if he hadn't slept, and he greeted me with an unsettling, urgent smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice unsteady. "You're precisely on time. I checked the bus schedule for you." I forced a nervous laugh, informed him we wouldn't open for another 30 minutes, and attempted to unlock the doors without allowing him entry. Throughout this interaction, he stood uncomfortably close, breathing heavily. Eventually, he backed away, pacing until opening time. My coworker Bree noticed my distress and asked if I was all right. When I explained Lawrence's monitoring of my arrivals, she appeared troubled. "I heard from a customer that he suffers from mental health issues," she confided. "They say he has schizophrenia and may not be taking his medication consistently." This revelation left me conflicted. On one hand, I empathized deeply. Mental illness can be devastating, as I've witnessed within my own family. On the other hand, I was genuinely frightened. His behavior was evolving into something obsessive, and I didn't know how to address it safely. A week later, I disembarked from my bus in the early evening, and immediately sensed someone watching me. Sure enough, Lawrence stood on the corner, partially concealed behind a street sign. He followed me halfway to my apartment building, never approaching too closely, but maintaining a distance where I could clearly hear his footsteps, echoing mine. I accelerated my pace, dread rising in my throat. I clutched my keys between my fingers, prepared to either unlock my door swiftly or use them defensively, if necessary. When I finally reached my building complex, I could no longer see him anywhere. The following day, I informed Jade that I felt unsafe around Lawrence. She offered to adjust my hours, so I wouldn't have to close alone or arrive when it was still dark. For a while this arrangement seemed effective. Lawrence visited less frequently, or perhaps our schedules simply no longer overlapped. Then one Friday afternoon, I found myself alone on shift because Bree had called in sick, and Jade was attending a meeting across town. Unfortunate timing. The cafe was nearly empty, with just a couple of lingering customers. The clock read 3:15 p.m. when Lawrence entered. He appeared disheveled, jacket worn backward, or perhaps hastily donned in distress. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes were bloodshot. His complexion looked sallow and clammy. I attempted to maintain my composure. "So Lawrence, what can I get for you today?" He stood motionless at the counter, expressionless, then began muttering. "They're all lying to you. I need you to tell me the truth. Are you recording me?" I blinked in confusion. "What?" He raised a trembling finger toward my face, pointing specifically at my hair. "Your earpiece, you're an informant." I wasn't wearing any earpiece, just a simple hair elastic. Something in his eyes changed, then, a shift that sent ice through my veins. He lunged forward, slamming his palm on the counter. Several customers by the window gasped audibly. I backed away instinctively, fear crawling up my spine. "Lawrence," I said softly, "perhaps you should sit down. I can bring you some water." He shook his head violently, eyes brimming with tears. No more deception. Then he turned and fled. My knees weakened considerably. The couple seated by the window hurried over to check on me. I was deeply shaken, but assured them everything was fine, that he was simply having a difficult day. Perhaps I was making excuses for him, but I didn't want to create panic. I hoped that would be the end of it. But then closing time approached. Bree had come in for the latter part of the shift, but departed at 7 p.m. for a medical appointment. By 7:30 p.m., I was alone again, completing final tasks for the night. It was dark outside, and unusually windy. I began wiping tables, constantly monitoring the entrance. I couldn't relax. I kept hoping no customers would arrive, especially not Lawrence. The attack occurred without warning. One moment I was placing chairs onto tables. The next I heard heavy footsteps. I turned to find Lawrence, somehow inside the shop. It was as if he had materialized from nowhere. I never heard the door open. He looked consumed by hatred. His face streaked with tears. He was breathing heavily, shoulders squared aggressively. In his left hand, he clutched a box cutter. I froze completely. "Let's put that down," I whispered, attempting to back away. He advanced, cornering me against the counter. "You've been lying," he hissed, "telling them where to find me. You want them to lock me away." I trembled violently, shaking my head. "I'm not telling anyone anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I just work here." His eyes darted around frantically, as if searching for surveillance devices. Then, with a sudden desperate cry, he slashed the box cutter toward me. I leaped backward, screaming as it grazed my arm, leaving a sharp, burning sensation. I attempted to dash around him, but he seized my wrist. In that terrifying moment, I realized he might actually end my life. He seemed completely detached from reality, perceiving me as some sort of enemy. I wrenched my arm free and shoved him backward with all my strength. He staggered, colliding with a table. I seized that opportunity and sprinted for the door. I felt another slash at my side, a searing pain across my ribs, but adrenaline propelled me forward. I stumbled into the parking lot, screaming desperately for help. A passing driver must have witnessed the altercation through the windows. Police arrived quickly. Lawrence was still behind me, breathing heavily, but when the sirens activated, he collapsed to his knees. He clutched his head, sobbing uncontrollably. The box cutter fell from his grasp. 2 officers restrained him immediately. An ambulance transported me to the hospital. I had sustained 2 deep lacerations, but thankfully, no vital organs were damaged. I later learned that Lawrence was charged, underwent psychiatric evaluation, and was committed to a mental health facility. Honestly, I experienced a strange mixture of compassion and terror upon hearing this news. To this day, I suffer recurring nightmares, where I see his eyes and feel his grip on my wrist. My mind forces me to relive the slashing sensation of that box cutter against my skin. I still work at Good Vibes, but I've established a non-negotiable boundary. I will never work alone. If I'm scheduled to work alone, I simply won't show up. If another employee leaves during my shift for any reason, I leave immediately. As well, fortunately, Jade has implemented additional security measures, improved locks, enhanced alarm systems. I wish I could fully move beyond this experience, but I don't believe humans are designed to completely recover from such traumatic events. At least I can take solace in knowing it's over.
The Event Horizon from Richie Finch. I always begin my shift at 5 in the evening,
So I've established a ritual of visiting my favorite coffee shop approximately 30 minutes beforehand. It's not a famous chain establishment. It's an intimate, independently owned cafe. The sign outside has faded slightly, and the hours inscribed on the window can sometimes be difficult to discern. But I cherish the atmosphere inside. It's become an integral part of my daily routine. Enter, acknowledge the baristas with a nod, order my cafe mocha with an additional espresso shot, and take a brief moment to decompress before starting work. Being a security guard at a local mall can be stressful at times, and that coffee serves as my evening lifeline. On this particular evening, I'd arrived somewhat earlier than usual, resulting in fewer patrons being present. Only one person stood in the queue ahead of me. The cafe always plays subdued music, and the overhead lighting provides a warm, inviting ambiance. I adore the aroma of freshly roasted beans and sweet pastries. It instantly elevates my mood. Everything seemed perfectly normal that day, until I noticed the staff behind the counter engaged in urgent, hushed conversation. This was unusual for such a relaxed establishment. When they spotted me, they beckoned me over, appearing relieved by my arrival. "Hey, Graham," said Mariana, the primary barista. She greeted me by name as she always did, but her voice contained a subtle tremor this time. Her gaze repeatedly darted toward the back hallway. Something strange is happening in the supply room. Could you possibly help us investigate? I frowned, looking from one barista to another. Rico, who typically teases me about my uniform, appeared unnaturally pale. A third staff member I barely recognized kept her eyes fixed on the floor. None seemed eager to elaborate. My initial assumption was a potential break-in, or perhaps vermin. But if it were merely rodents, why would they appear so thoroughly unnerved? Sure, I replied hesitantly, glancing at my watch. I have a few minutes to spare, but what exactly is the situation? Mariana looked uncomfortable, as though reluctant to explain. Finally, she shook her head. It's simply easier to show you. She gestured toward the rear of the cafe. I noticed she remained stationary behind the counter until she realized I expected her to accompany me. We proceeded down a narrow corridor, lined with various framed coffee-themed artwork, the typical cafe decor. I had walked this path countless times en route to the restroom. The air felt strangely dense now, though. Perhaps that was merely the tension radiating from Mariana and Rico. They halted approximately 10 feet from a closed door labeled supply room. "Are you certain I should be back here?" "I'm not an employee," I questioned. "Go ahead," Mariana whispered, arms tightly crossed over her chest. "I just want you to attempt to approach that door." I gave her a bewildered look, then laughed nervously. "Approach the door? That's all? Why?" Rico cleared his throat. "Look, this sounds irrational, but every time one of us has tried to open it tonight, anyone, even our newest hire, we experience this overwhelming wave of terror. It becomes impossible to breathe, like your heart might explode." I had tears streaming down my face involuntarily. I physically cannot touch that doorknob, no matter how hard I try. I stared at him, convinced they were orchestrating an elaborate prank. It was that kind of narrative, a practical joke to unsettle the unsuspecting visitor. Except I wasn't a newcomer. I'd been frequenting this establishment for nearly a year. "You're playing a joke on me," I said, offering a half smile. Rico looked away, then nodded at Mariana. She stepped forward, inhaled shakily, and began walking toward the door. She managed perhaps 3 steps before freezing in place. I watched her face contort into an expression of pure, undiluted horror, as if she were witnessing something unspeakably traumatic. Her eyes widened unnaturally, and she released a strangled gasp, stumbling backward. Either she possessed extraordinary acting talents, or she genuinely wasn't performing. My chest constricted just observing her reaction. She retreated so rapidly she nearly lost her balance, colliding with Rico. She trembled violently, refusing to even glance in the door's direction again. "See what I mean?" Rico said, eyes wide with apprehension. We're not deceiving you. It's not fabricated. We physically cannot approach it. We've attempted repeatedly throughout the evening. We haven't been able to restock cups or sugar or anything essential. Customers keep inquiring why we appear so distressed. A chill permeated my body. Despite my skepticism, their reactions were unmistakably authentic. Perhaps a gas leak was responsible, or some chemical substance in that room, triggering a panic response. But that explanation failed to address a critical question. How would the effect dissipate immediately upon retreating? "So you want me to open the door?" I asked. "Yes," Mariana replied breathlessly. "You are a security professional, right? You're equipped to handle stressful situations." I nodded slowly, swallowing the nervous lump forming in my throat. Their confidence in my capabilities admittedly inflated my ego somewhat. After all, I was essentially just a mall security guard. "I'll try," I agreed cautiously. "But if this turns out to be an elaborate joke, I expect a free mocha every day for a month." Mariana didn't even hint at a smile. She simply stepped aside, creating a path for me. I took one step forward, then another, initially feeling nothing unusual. The hallway light buzzed faintly overhead. My footsteps echoed unnervingly loud against the floor. As I approached within 3 feet of the door, something like static electricity began crawling beneath my skin. But I dismissed it as mere suggestion, my mind anticipating what they had described. When I reached inches from the doorknob, however, an overwhelming and inexplicable terror crashed into me like a physical force. It felt like stepping unknowingly into the path of an oncoming vehicle, pure instinctive panic. My breath caught in my throat as adrenaline flooded my system, yet I couldn't force myself to move forward. Tears involuntarily formed at the corners of my eyes, from the sheer intensity of that dread. "Graham, it's just a door," I whispered to myself, my entire body now trembling uncontrollably. I extended my arm, hand shaking so severely, I couldn't maintain any semblance of steadiness. The doorknob, brass and worn with age, seemed impossibly distant, though it remained just inches away. I attempted to force my hand closer, but my knees began to buckle. A jolt of primal fear immobilized me, as if an invisible barrier were actively repelling me. I gasped, staggering backward, nearly losing my balance entirely. I had never experienced anything remotely comparable. Tears streamed down my face involuntarily. It was raw, unadulterated terror, as if every fear I'd ever harbored had been distilled into a single horrifying moment. Within seconds I retreated halfway down the corridor, struggling to catch my breath. Mariana and Rico caught me, each grasping an arm to stabilize me. For several moments, none of us spoke.
My breathing remained ragged and uneven. Finally, Mariana murmured, "Now you understand why we sought your help. We've attempted to contact the owner, but she's currently away, and none of us can approach that door. We're at a complete loss. We have no explanation for what's happening." I wanted to respond, but words eluded me. It required a full 30 seconds of shaky silence before I could formulate a coherent thought. This is impossible," I finally managed. "We should contact emergency services, fire department, police, someone. Perhaps there's a chemical leak, or some electromagnetic anomaly affecting our brain chemistry." Rico's eyes darted nervously toward the door, then back to me. "We already called the non-emergency line. The officers assumed we were perpetrating a hoax. They indicated they would dispatch someone for a legitimate threat, but once we described the situation, they dismissed us entirely. So what's your plan? You can't simply close the cafe indefinitely, can you?" Mariana exchanged a meaningful glance with Rico and shrugged helplessly. "We might have no alternative. Customers will inevitably notice our failure to restock, and we can't risk employees collapsing in the back corridor." Feeling a nauseating mixture of dread and confusion, I wiped my face,
attempting to conceal the fact that I was still trembling. Let me attempt one more approach, I suggested, though the mere idea sent a renewed surge of anxiety through my body. I'll hold my breath and simply charge forward to open it quickly. That's how I acquired this, Rico admitted, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a dark bruise on his forearm. I attempted the rushing tactic earlier. The outcome wasn't favorable. I clenched my jaw, still struggling to process what was happening. The memory of that inexplicable terror remained as vivid as a physical wound. I just don't understand, I muttered. A door shouldn't be capable of generating that response. It's as if the room itself is radiating fear. That's precisely it, Mariana confirmed. Whatever resides within, or whatever surrounds that entrance, it's fundamentally unnatural. Eventually, I steeled myself for one final attempt. I advanced a few steps forward, my heart racing uncontrollably. This time, the fear struck with such violence that I couldn't even raise my arm. My legs threatened to collapse beneath me. It felt as if my mind were screaming desperate warnings to retreat. I had no choice but to stumble backward, tears flooding my eyes once more. Regardless of my determination, I physically could not force myself to touch that doorknob. Some primal survival instinct completely overrode my conscious intentions. Mariana nodded, as if accepting our collective defeat. I don't know how we can maintain operations under these circumstances, but thank you for attempting, Graham. I cleared my throat and checked my watch. I needed to report for my shift soon, and my head was still reeling from the experience. I'm truly sorry I couldn't be more helpful. Will you be all right? We'll devise some solution, Rico replied, though his tone lacked conviction. I bid them good night and departed immediately. The adrenaline continued surging through my system. I desperately needed fresh air more than I needed caffeine at that point. As I stepped outside, the cool breeze felt rejuvenating, like awakening from a nightmare. I walked briskly to my car, glancing back at the cafe's warmly illuminated windows. From the exterior, there was no indication of anything supernatural, but I knew with absolute certainty what I had experienced. That overwhelming dread was no psychological trick. It was tangible, and more intense than anything I had ever encountered. Throughout my security shift that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I've handled countless alarm responses, and secured numerous doors, but never once have I been physically unable to turn a doorknob, due to inexplicable terror. I even searched online for paralyzing fear near a door during my break, but the results yielded only random ghost stories and anxiety disorder forums. None of it made logical sense. The following day, I had an early errand before my shift, so I visited the cafe around noon, hoping to speak with Mariana or Rico, or ideally both. Perhaps they had discovered a solution overnight. Instead, I found a sign affixed to the door, closed. Sorry for the inconvenience. I peered through the front windows. The lights were off, and chairs were stacked on tables. The interior was completely vacant. My stomach lurched uncomfortably. They never closed during midday, especially on weekdays. The sign appeared hastily taped up as well. Had something worse transpired overnight? Had they discovered what lurked in that supply room? Or had the staff simply abandoned the premises rather than contending with it? I attempted calling the cafe's phone number, but it directed straight to voicemail. I left a message, though I didn't genuinely expect a response. Throughout my subsequent shift, I couldn't dispel the pervasive uneasiness. Something had compelled them to close indefinitely, perhaps permanently. Maybe they would eventually contact specialists, or have the door forcibly removed. The possibilities continued circulating in my mind, each more disturbing than the last. As days passed, my favorite cafe remained shuttered, with no explanation provided. Eventually, I checked again and discovered a new notice in the window. Under renovation.
but there were no construction vehicles or workers present. The establishment simply sat there in eerie silence. I never saw Mariana or Rico again. If that door, and whatever it concealed, drove them away permanently, I suspect I'll never learn the truth. I miss that cafe, but perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved.
The note from Carly A.J. I've served as the opening staff member at our coffee shop for nearly 2 years. It's always been a straightforward routine. Arrive at 5:45 a.m., deactivate the alarm system, illuminate the space, and begin brewing the first batch of drip coffee to welcome our early patrons. Nothing about this process was ever mysterious or noteworthy. That is, until several weeks ago, when I began discovering a single folded note on the front counter almost every morning. Initially, I assumed it was communication from a night shift colleague, perhaps alerting me to low inventory or malfunctioning equipment. But it wasn't that at all. The note, written in elegant cursive, simply stated, "Don't look outside at 2:13 p.m. No explanation. No signature. I remember standing there holding the paper, eyebrow raised quizzically, trying to determine which coworker possessed this peculiar sense of humor. When I inquired, everyone professed ignorance. By lunchtime, I had discarded the note. The following day, another appeared. Identical handwriting, identical message. Don't look outside at 2:13 p.m. This time, I pinned it to the bulletin board in our break room as a lighthearted response to the anonymous author. Everyone who passed through commented on it, generating amused speculation. What's supposed to happen at 2:13? The apocalypse. One colleague suggested it might be a bizarre marketing tactic. Perhaps we would introduce a special promotion at precisely 2:13. We forgot about it amid the midday rush of orders, but the day after, it reappeared. Now I was becoming genuinely unsettled. We secure the cafe every night, and only staff members possess access. How did these notes keep materializing? I verified that each scheduled employee was accounted for, yet no one claimed responsibility for the mysterious messages. I eventually brought it to my manager's attention, who shrugged indifferently and advised, if it's not disrupting business operations, just ignore it. The message was undeniably strange, but I decided there were more pressing concerns requiring my attention. The problem was, regardless of how many times I discarded or displayed these notes, I would arrive each morning to find the same perfectly folded paper lying on the counter. I would ask the closing staff if they had left any messages for me, and they would consistently deny it. This meant it had to be occurring after closing, but before my arrival. The most perplexing aspect was that nothing else in the establishment ever appeared disturbed. No broken windows, no compromised locks, just that solitary note. Approximately 1 week later, I made the fateful mistake of disregarding the warning entirely. I convinced myself it was probably just a bored individual accessing the premises with a misplaced key. The day everything changed was a Monday. As usual, we opened at 6 a.m. and maintained a steady flow of regular customers throughout the morning. Around 2 p.m., the rush had subsided, and I was organizing the condiment station while chatting with a coworker about weekend activities. That's when I suddenly recalled the note. Checking my phone, I saw it was 2:11 p.m. I nearly laughed. "Hey, it's almost that magical time," I joked to my colleague. He rolled his eyes once he understood my reference, then suggested, maybe we should lower the blinds, just to be safe. I responded teasingly. Why? Is some mythical creature going to manifest? My phone display changed to 2:12 p.m. I turned toward the front window. Outside everything appeared perfectly normal. Parked vehicles, passing traffic, pedestrians on their usual routes. A moment later, my phone indicated 2:13 p.m. I'm not certain I can adequately describe what I witnessed then. Initially, it was merely a silhouette, someone standing across the street, partially obscured by a tree trunk. I assumed it was simply a pedestrian or local resident, but something about their stance made my stomach contract painfully. They stood unnaturally rigid, head oriented directly toward our cafe window, face concealed by shadow. They remained completely motionless, but I had the distinct impression they were staring, specifically at me. I attempted to breathe normally, telling myself the timing was coincidental, and was merely making me unnecessarily anxious. Then the figure stepped away from the tree, and into full view. I expected to see a normal human form. Instead, I observed that the limbs appeared unnaturally elongated, and the posture was disturbingly contorted. In that moment, everything surrounding me became indistinct and blurred, everything except that figure, which remained in horrifying focus. I couldn't blink. I couldn't avert my gaze. I heard my coworker's voice sounding distant and distorted as he repeatedly asked, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" But I was incapable of responding. I watched, transfixed, as the figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, a gesture completely devoid of warmth that felt more like a threat or a claim. That's when my coworker grasped my arm forcefully enough to break whatever trance had overtaken me. I stumbled backward. By the time I had blinked and looked again, the entity had vanished, as if it had never existed. But I remained profoundly shaken. My hands trembled so severely, I couldn't even hold a coffee cup. My coworker stood there demanding to know what had happened, but I couldn't yet articulate the experience coherently. It wasn't simply some unusual stranger. There was something fundamentally wrong about that figure that transcended normal human parameters. Right after that incident, as if the mission had been accomplished by whatever force was at work, the notes ceased appearing. It was as if something out there had simply wanted to terrify me thoroughly. I no longer look out the windows at work unless absolutely necessary, and when I must, I always check the time first. I don't know what entity I encountered. Perhaps it was an elaborate prank orchestrated by strangers I've never met. That's what I prefer to believe. But that explanation doesn't account for the profound dread and terror I experienced, emotions that still resurface whenever I recall that day. Everything about the experience defies rational explanation. Oh, but don't let this discourage you from visiting your favorite cafe for your daily white chocolate mocha or regular coffee with 2 creams and 2 sugars. Whichever caffeinated concoction energizes your day. Coffee shops may occasionally harbor mysterious entities, but ultimately, caffeine is worth confronting your fears for.